Hey, Dr. Jack Gordy here, and today I'm going to be continuing the debate, continuing to try and convince you that free will doesn't exist. And today we're going to be jumping into molecular determinism. So let's jump straight into it. So what is molecular determinism? Well, let's follow this continuum. Let's follow this this biological process. Here we have RNA polymerase. And it is reading the DNA and generating an mRNA in yellow coming out of the top here. There's no freedom here. This is a molecular process of which you're completely unaware, and so you cannot make any decisions about the activity of this molecule. This is happening whether you like it or not, and it is governed by the laws of physics that are occurring inside the cell. That RNA is then read by a ribosome, and here we can see the tRNA coming in here and the protein coming out the top here, and this is the RNA here, the mRNA here. So this mRNA transcript, which was just transcribed from the DNA, is now being translated into a protein. So we can see this protein being made, and this is obviously, again, following the laws of physics, of which you have no free will on. That protein was actually a membrane receptor. It's gone through the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi, and it's found itself into the cell membrane, and it's actually an AMPA receptor, and here it is just sitting in the cell membrane. Again, its pathway through the cell and its entry into the cellular membrane, you had no control over. This is an AMPA receptor, so it responds to GABA, it lets sodium in, which can lead to, which, if is happening in enough dendrites, in enough synapses and to enough receptors, can result in depolarization. So we've got the sodium rushing in that can cause voltage-gated channels to activate, and we end up with depolarization of the neuron, all starting with that RNA polymerase and ending with depolarization of the neuron. And at no point was there freedom there. It was all just physical processes governed by the laws of physics. Now that neuron may fire. Here we have a bunch of neurons, and they're all connected together, and they're all firing together, and they're causing each other to fire. So the firing of one neuron then may cause its release of glutamate onto a postsynaptic neuron, which contributes to the sum total of the synaptic signaling coming in to that neuron, which may reach the threshold to cause an action potential and firing. And so these that which may then inhibit or activate a downstream neuron to that neuron. And so we have a collections of neurons that are all firing or not firing depending on the molecular state of the extracellular milieu and the intracellular environment, and what proteins are expressed on the surface of these neurons at what density, and the release of neurotransmitters, all of which are physical processes that you have no free will over. This is actually occurring in a cell culture plate. So these neurons are outside the body, growing in a dish, and again, they can just fire and behave much like normal neurons inside your brain, because it's a physical process. It's just molecules following the laws of physics results in neuronal firing. Now, this spreads throughout the regions of the brain, as the regions of the brain now begin to interact down axonal highways connecting different regions of the brain, and it results in neuronal activity here. And this is sort of smoothed over time. And so we can see we can get massive cortical neuronal activity occurring, all starting from the RNA polymerase in each of those neurons, which generated the proteins, which generated the extracellular receptors, as well as which generated the enzymes that created neurotransmitters. All of this is molecular processes of which you have no control over. This is really cool because when an area of the brain is hyperactive, those neurons need more energy and produce more waste, so they need more blood supply. And so your blood supply actually vasodilates and vasocontracts to redirect blood to where your brain is most active. We can then look at that with a machine called fMRI to see which areas of the brain you're using more based on the amount of blood flow that's going to them. But all of these processes are completely independent of your free will. They are physical processes completely determined by the molecular and physical state of the brain, and they are completely downstream events. Just like those pool balls, really. It's just one molecule knocking into another, following the laws of physics, that results in this electrical activity as well as this vascular activity of which you have no control over. But the problem is all these processes is what leads to ideas. and choices, right? And so where does the freedom come into it? If a network of neurons is activated of which you had no control over, and that network of activation gives you an idea, where did that idea come from? And were you free to do that? Could you have done otherwise given the molecular state of your mind? And the argument, of course, in molecular determinism is no, right? You are not free to break your cells from the laws of physics. Your brain is governed by the laws of physics. And we intuitively know that our brains are molecular things that make molecular interactions, right? We intuitively know that. And do you know how I know that we intuitively know this? This molecule right here, you might recognize it as alcohol, right? Now, if we drink this molecule, right, we know it can make us make different choices, right? So the drunk Florida man tries to use a taco as an ID. There is no doubt that this man would not have tried to use a taco as a personal ID to a policeman if this molecule wasn't in his brain, right? So he made different decisions based on the molecular state of his brain, and this molecular state of the brain was influenced by this molecule right here, ethanol. Another example might be LSD. Teen fight high on LSD starts a fight with a mailbox, right? He would not have started a fight with a mailbox if he had not altered the molecular state of his brain with LSD. So why is it that we truly and deeply understand that molecules alter our behavior and free will, but only really accept that molecules alter our free will and alter our decisions and generate our decisions when those molecules come from outside our body, like drugs? But the molecules inside our body, we have no control over either, and they definitely affect the decisions that we make. So it's almost this cognitive dissonance here. We can say that alcohol changes your behavior and decisions, and it is a molecule, but we refuse to believe that the molecules that are produced inside our brain, such as GABA, which is how alcohol works, it increases the GABA neurotransmitter signaling pathway by increasing binding time, they think. Why is it that we think that alcohol, which alters GABA signaling, influences our decision, but we don't acknowledge that GABA signaling itself is where our decisions come from? You know, influences our decisions. GABA and glutamate and all these neurotransmitters altering our decisions. It's a really interesting cognitive dissonance, but I would push you to say you have to acknowledge that the molecules of your brain dictate your decisions if you acknowledge that molecules that you put into your brain alter your decisions and free will. So this is where we come to molecular determinism. Because our ideas, decisions, and behaviors are downstream of molecular phenomena, which are governed by the laws of physics and not our free will, we cannot possibly have free will, right? We are molecular machines, is another way of putting that. Now, a common argument against this, perhaps, and maybe where you're going to with this, is can our behavior alter the molecular state of our brain, right? So, you know, if I do gambling and I like gambling, you know, we sort of know that that increases dopamine signaling in your reward circuits of your brain. Isn't that me doing an activity, a behavior, gambling, which is altering the molecular state of our brain? Now, there's a few problems with this concept, that there's this interaction and somehow will is coming into this formula because behavior can alter the molecular state of our brain. And one of the problems is imprecision, right? The molecular state of our brain has infinite and precise control of behavior. Now, the brain is so complex we could never predict what the brain is going to do, but it is fair to say that the exact molecular positions and function and movement and interactions of the molecules in our brain have 100% control of our behavior and will, because that's where our behavior and will comes from. It comes from the brain. So the brain must have complete control over behavior, and the brain is a physical object made of molecules, right? While behavior has a nebulous and imprecise and unpredictable control over the molecular state of the brain, right? If I was to ask you to be happier or increase your serotonin signaling, or if I was to, ask you to bump up your glutamate signaling right now, or decrease your GABA signaling right now, you wouldn't be able to do it, right? And the outcomes of your behavior of the molecular state of the brain. So we can see there that sort of there is no space for free will because of this 100% control of behavior from the molecular state of the brain and an imprecise control of the behavior over the molecular state of the brain. You can't change your brain if you wanted to, right? And here's an example of this. Now, this is a rough example, but if we put electrodes into the reward circuits of a rat brain and hook that up to a lever, the rat will accidentally bump the lever and then go, wait a minute, well, what was that? And eventually the rat will start pushing that lever forever, which is what we can see here. And they will push that lever even until they starve to death. Theoretically, I don't know if anyone's actually done that experiment, but we've seen that they will not eat or drink for periods of time whilst just pushing this lever over and over and over again. So here we can see by altering the electrical and thus the molecular state of a small region of the brain, we can gain precise control over the behavior of the animal. They will 100% do this activity forever by just taking even mild control over the molecular state of a very small region of the brain, right? So it's just a good way to visualize that the molecular state and the physical state of your brain has complete control of your behavior. So there's no space for free will, is there? Now, the other problem is the first mover principle, right? So we've got the cycle here. Who was first, right? If behavior was first and dictated the molecular state of the brain, you might argue that perhaps there was free will in the beginning that dictated the molecular state of the brain, and then around we go. But obviously, you can clearly see that the first mover is going to be the molecular state of a brain. Here we have a human embryo, 6 weeks old, and so it's the size of a grain of rice, and this is when neuronal activity first starts. Now, we would say that there's no behavior going on. There's certainly no freedom or free will by any definition. I don't think anyone would describe a 6-week-old embryo as having free will. And so behavior, there's no choices, there's no behavior, is not the first mover. The first mover is the molecular state of the brain. And so this may dictate that, which determines this, which determines that. And so the first movement, the first action that determined all subsequent actions was the molecular state of the brain. So there was no room for free will. And this brings an interesting question, right? If our brain is governed by just the laws of physics, right? And therefore free will can't come into it. What else could we look at in this world to sort of use as an analogy for a lack of free will? So here is a rock, right? No one in the world would say that a rock has free will. But here's the interesting thing. Rocks seem to make decisions and have behaviors. So here we have a bunch of rocks all together modeled in a computer model. Basically, if you jiggle those rocks, the large rocks seem to make the decision to go up, and the small rocks make the decision to go down. Now, this process is called the Brazil nut effect, which I think is one of the best physical effect names ever. And it comes from the fact if you take a bag of mixed nuts and you shake it, the large Brazil nuts go to the top, and the small peanuts go to the bottom, and the salt that's on the bottom, that's the smallest particle of all, goes right to the bottom of the bag. So the Brazil nut effect is this process, and we can see it. Like here's a riverbed of rocks. All the large rocks are on top, and you guys know and you will have experienced this. If you go lift up one of those large rocks, underneath will be small gravelly rock, and underneath that might be sand. And that's the Brazil nut effect, and this could be described as behavior. This is a decision by the big rocks to go up and by the small rocks to go down. Now you would say, hold on a minute, there's no decision being made. There's no free will there. Rocks do not have free will. They are just following the laws of physics, right? And you can see where you meet your problem there. If the neurons in your brain and the calcium ions flushing in and the sodium ions coming in and the potassium ions going out of the cell, if that is all just governed by the laws of physics, then you don't have free will. So either the rock and you both have free will somehow, or you both don't have free will because you are both just governed by the laws of physics. And so even though our behavior is complex and has the appearance of free will, we see behavior in inanimate objects, and we would not describe those inanimate objects as free. Now, often the defense of this is, yes, but you could predict the rocks. All the big rocks go to the top, all the small rocks go to the bottom. It's 100% predictable, and whereas humans are unpredictable. So humans can do unpredictable things that seem to have no immediate cause, right? You know, in that deterministic chain, some of our behavior seems to have no immediate cause. And so unlike rocks, we are unpredictable, which means that we are free, right? All large rocks have to go up. So, you know, they're not really free. They have to do that. Whereas humans seem to be unpredictable. And so therefore, maybe we are free because of that. And this is where an interesting theory comes into it. It's called the chaos theory. And it's a great theory, right? And chaos theory basically states that complexity makes predictions very difficult, but it does not eliminate deterministic causality, right? So here we have a very, very simple system of two pendulums swinging back and forth, right? Now these pendulums actually start in slightly different positions. You can see the blue line there. It's just a little bit lower. It's 1 degree off, but they still act in a very similar and predictable way, right? And that's because this system is incredibly simple. But if we bump up the complexity just a little, now this is only a tiny bit. So now instead of having a single fulcrum by which the single point by which the pendulum swing, we've got two. So the pendulums, there's a point here that goes up to another hinge point there, which then goes down to the weight there. Now there's actually two pendulums here, a red one and a green one. And they are only out by a fraction of a degree. So in the previous one, they were out by a whole degree, but in this one, they're out by a fraction of a degree. And the only effect that's been modeled here is gravity. There is no other physical process going on. We've got gravity, and we've got 2 points of swinging of those pendulums. Now let's see what happens. We can see that immediately they break apart completely different, right? And so this is what we call the chaos effect. Slight minor changes in initial conditions in even slightly complicated systems, like this isn't a complicated system, it's only slightly complicated, can result in completely unpredictable events. But no one here would say that the movements aren't determined by the laws of physics and aren't completely governed by the laws of physics. And in fact, I could run the simulation over and over again, and we would get the same result for the red and green one every single time, because we're just following deterministic laws of physics, of gravity and of swinging and of pendulums. But it results in completely unpredictable events. It's a really interesting story about where this theory came from. It came from sort of the first computers, right? This is the first computer, and it doesn't have silicon chips. It's pre that, and it prints its output on a giant printer here. And what this Lorenz, this scientist, was trying to investigate is he was trying to investigate convection currents, which is that hot things go up and cold things come down, and what behavior is that? And he designed a very simple model with only 3 variables, X, Y, and Z, into this model to try and model how convection currents work. So this is a lava lamp. This wax blob will heat up and it will go up and then it will cool and come back down. That's a convection current, right? And he tried to model it. And his computer could handle up to 6 decimal places, which is pretty powerful at the time. This is very early on. And he would run his model, and the model would take a long time, and the numbers would interact as they attempted to model a convection current. Now, this modeling would take a long time, and so one run it ended, and he, rather than wanting to run the whole simulation again of convection currents from the beginning, Lorenz decided to take the numbers from halfway and plug them into his formulas again and see what came out. So he plugged those into his formula just so he could start the simulation again halfway through. The problem is that the printer only printed the first 3 digits of his number, while the computer calculated 6. So this old printer would only print 3 numbers, whereas the computer was working with 6 digits. But these numbers are basically the same, to a fraction of a percentage difference, right? They are virtually the same, right? We're talking about 0.0002 off 246 off. So very minor differences in these numbers. But what Lorenz noticed was that suddenly there was a huge divergence and the final output was completely different. Now, the reason why Lorenz wanted to model convection was he wanted to model the weather. And what he realized was that these systems are chaotic, right? And only a slight difference in initial conditions, a fraction of a percent, can result in massive changes downstream. And this whole chaos theory in the weather resulted in the saying of the butterfly effect, which is the idea the flapping of a wings of a butterfly in Hobart, right, could many years down the track cause a hurricane in New York, right, for example. Or a cyclone. I forget which one. Different hemispheres. But yeah, so we could have a hurricane in New York because of a butterfly flapping its wings. So a butterfly slightly alters the molecular pattern around it. And that slight change ripples throughout the entire atmosphere and results in a completely different set of conditions many years down the track, which precipitates a hurricane in New York. And if that butterfly didn't exist, perhaps there wouldn't have been a hurricane, right? And which is essentially what is going on here. We changed the initial conditions very slightly, and it resulted in a massive change downstream. And this is why long-term weather predictions are actually really bad, right? You can only know if you're going to be playing cricket on Saturday if you look at the weather on Thursday or Friday. If you look at the weather on Monday, that's not a guarantee you're going to be playing cricket on Saturday. So, but no one would say that even though weather is completely unpredictable, no one would say weather is free, would you? There's no free will in weather, even though it is unpredictable and infinitely complex and has behaviors, right? The weather is angry when there's a hurricane and is peaceful when there is no wind, right? So we could argue that weather has behavior and what appears to be decisions. Should you have a hurricane or not? That's a decision, right? And it's incredibly complex, but it's unpredictable, but we wouldn't say the weather is free. Weather is chaotic, much like the human brain, right? If we alter the molecular state of the human brain, all these molecules interact in massive ways, and each one is so complexly determined by the previous state that even subtle changes in the molecular state of the brain may result in unpredictable behaviors, very quickly, right? So even slightly complex systems, minor changes in initial conditions can generate massive differences relatively quickly. And humans are complex, that's unpredictable, but that doesn't mean we're not dependent on the physical state of our brain. And this is sort of a side note, just a little side note. Oh, wait, let me just quickly say, we don't believe that weather or free will or lava lamps have free will, even though they're unpredictable and seem to have behavior and make decisions, right? They don't, yeah, right? But a little side note, real cool side note is, in order for internet security to work, we need to generate random numbers, right? That's just kind of a fact. But it's very hard to generate a truly random number. When you generate a random number in Excel, what it actually does is it types in a formula. And so there is what's called pseudo-randomness in there. If you could know that formula and the initial numbers going into it, you could predict the random number that comes out, right? So we call it pseudo-random. It's not quite random. But there are companies that generate true random numbers for the use of internet security and other things. And one example is the company that just has a whole bunch of lava lamps and little cameras, and the cameras take a digital reading based on the image that is generated by the blobs in the lava lamps on the wall. And that by doing that creates a truly random number because of the convection currents in a lava lamp are completely unpredictable and the physical causes that go into it are unknown. And so we end up with random numbers just by looking at a lava lamp, which is really cool. And it goes back to the original Lorenz discovery of chaos theory, right? Or description of chaos theory. Now, an argument might be, Jack, a hurricane in the weather or the blob going up in a lava lamp isn't a decision, right? You might say that is not a decision. And so that's the defining difference. Not only do you have to be unpredictable, so rocks don't have free will because they're predictable, lava lamps are unpredictable, but perhaps they don't truly make decisions. So we wouldn't say that they have free will. So here I've written a computer program for you, and this little dot is wandering around randomly. You could not predict where this dot goes. It's following a random function. However, when the big mama dot comes out of the house and yells at the little baby dot, we say the baby dot gets scared and runs back into the house. He's been told off for wandering around. So one could argue that this is the decision. It is choosing to run away from that dot. And it is exhibiting clear behavior that we might even describe as fear. So it is both unpredictable and now making decisions. And what you might say is, yeah, but it's just following code that you have written. And so although it is seemingly making decisions, and it is also unpredictable, because we can see that code and know that there is a code that describes its behavior, we don't think it's free, right? And so this is the crux of molecular determinism, is that the neuroanatomy structures, the cellular anatomy and the molecular positions of all the molecules in your brain is equivalent to code that dictates your behavior, right? So these neurons here and their activity and their molecular positions is basically the computer code that codes your behavior. And we know this because if you alter the molecular positions, or you alter the molecular interactions with direct stimulation or with drugs, we alter the code and we alter the behavior, right? So your behavior, just like that dot, is dependent on the code which is written into your brain in the form of molecules, right? But I'm willing to bet you are still unconvinced, and I don't know if I will ever convince you. So up in the next video, we're going to cover anatomical determinism.